All right, peace family. This is Dayvon Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. This is our third episode of our Streets to the Statehouse podcast in this 2026 Maryland General Assembly. The purpose of this podcast is those who follow our work to give you kind of an in-depth analysis of, some of the things that we're working on, the status of them, and just providing more context for people that want to be more engaged and are interested. One of the things is always to note about our perspective. We're an explicitly Black, radical, Pan-Africanist political organization. So because of that, autonomy, that perspective, that worldview, we're able to provide a kind of analysis on the Maryland General Assembly that you're not going to find in other contexts. And so that's why we feel like it's important to provide our viewership and our base the opportunity to get kind of an inside window into the work, that we're doing in the Maryland General Assembly. We're going to spend most of our time this evening talking about electoral politics, our approach to it, and some legislative work that we're doing related to that. What I want to do before we do that, though, if you look at the first episode of Streets of the Statehouse, that I give an in-depth look at all of the things that we're going to be looking at, both in terms of our legislative agenda, like our particular items, in addition to some of the other efforts that we're going to play a supporting role in helping to move forward. So if you're interested in a comprehensive analysis of our legislative priorities and the things we're paying attention to, go to the first episode of Streets of the Statehouse to get that information. What I'm going to do briefly is I'm going to give a bit of just some brief updates on our legislative items, an update on some of the things that we're paying attention to, and then we're going to jump into our conversation about electoral politics and the specific legislation that we're moving related to our perspective on electoral politics. So first major legislative item is reentry led by those who are formerly incarcerated. Working with Delegate Cheryl Pastor and Senator Charles Sidnor on a piece of legislation that would require the Department of Corrections to establish partnerships with organizations and individuals who are organizations led by those that are formerly incarcerated and individuals who are formerly incarcerated to have them do programming for folks behind the walls who are in prison, such that they have more effective transition outside of prison. So the work that we supported last year in this passage of the Second Look Act and a variety of other parole reforms, there are more people that are being released. And so we wanted to ensure that those who are formerly incarcerated, many of those networks that have been responsible for the declines of violence and homicides in Baltimore are those networks, many of which folks who have come behind the walls, who are mentored behind the walls and have come home with a purpose of wanting to make the communities better. And violence prevention has been a really important outlet for many of those folks to giving them purpose and providing them a role in the community that's important. That bill has been heard on both sides. There was no written opposition. Nobody testified in opposition in oral testimony. And so we expect that bill to pass. In some ways, it's a relatively light lift in terms of it as a legislative priority. It's going to be really important because it complements, again, efforts like Second Look to provide, some of that support for those that are reentering back into society and wanting to be productive. And so we had, great hearings in both the House and the Senate. So you should see some indication from LBS coming soon in terms of what you all can do to help to ensure that that bill continues on the trajectory that it's on. So that's the first update. Second, auto charging. So for those who are familiar with our legislative priorities, one of them is to end the practice of automatically charging youth as adults. In Maryland, there are 33 charges that if a young person is charged with any one of those charges, they're automatically in the adult system. 80 to 85% of the young people that are in the adult system end up being weighed back down to the juvenile system. 80% of those kids are Black kids. If they're in the adult system, that means that they are not entitled to education, not entitled to mental health services, and are, even though they're supposed to be sight and sound away from adults when they're in adult prison facilities, it functionally, in some respects, is like solitary confinement. So this dehumanizing practice, and it's a piece of legislation that's been put in, as far as we know, for at least 15 years, dating back to then Delegate Joe Carter, who was in the House of Delegates, who put in the first legislation that we know of to end this practice. The bill that is before the legislature does not end the practice entirely, but it captures 11 categories of charges that put young people automatically in the adult system that capture about 70 to 73% of the young people that are in the adult system. And so that's the bill that's before the legislature. The Senate sponsors the chair of the Judicial Proceedings Committee, Senator Will Smith of Montgomery County. Its House sponsor is the new chair of the House Judiciary Committee, Delegate Sandy Bartlett of Anne Arundel County. That actually bodes well to have two chairs of committees sponsor this bill. In many ways indicates that it is likely something is going to happen. It's really a question of ensuring that what ends up moving is strong enough and that it doesn't get watered down. So a big part of the work and support that we're going to need from those that are watching this podcast, either watching it now, who will watch it later, or just general supporters of ours, it'll be important for you all when we send out these action alerts to really focus on making sure it doesn't get watered down. And our biggest concern that has been our concern for the past couple of years in working this issue has been the Senate President, Bill Ferguson. So it's been Senator Ferguson over the past couple of years that has been the major block to moving this. In addition to former chair of the House Judiciary Committee, Luke Clippinger, who with him moved out of his chairmanship, and then Sandy Bartlett moving into that chairmanship and being the co-sponsor on the legislation, that resolved one of the major hurdles on that side. Now we're contending with Senator Ferguson, who has been a block to moving that, and so we're going to have to press extremely hard to ensure that when the bill comes over from the House to the Senate, that the Senate doesn't water it down. And one of the things that I'll just say that I think is important context is that the biggest opponents of this are the prosecutors, the Maryland State's Attorneys Association, which now is chaired by Ivan Bates. Those who are familiar with our work are familiar with the clashes in perspective and worldview and approach to criminal justice that we have with State's Attorney Ivan Bates. And so he's been one of the most vocal opponents of this piece of legislation. And you hear his concerns being echoed by Sinclair Media, like Sinclair Broadcasting on Fox 45. You hear it on many of the radio hosts in WBL Radio, who, I've been on Brian Neiman and C4 show once to talk about some of this. Got to give credit to TJ Smith, who's had me on, several times to talk about this issue. But you hear the talking points of the state's attorney being echoed through Sinclair Media, WBAL Radio, and a variety of other conservative media outlets that essentially echo what it is that they bring to the fore. So that's why it's going to be extremely important to pressure Bill Ferguson, because I am sure that a constituency that he is sensitive to are prosecutors. That I imagine his base in South Baltimore, parts of downtown, parts of Canton, like some of the more affluent parts of his district, for whom Sinclair Broadcasting, I believe, targets as one of its audiences. It's going to be really important that we put more pressure on Senator Ferguson than the prosecutors are able to put on him in the opposite direction. So that's something that's going to be really important for those that are listening or watching this to help with when we put out those action alerts. Our third legislative item, which we've explicitly said we don't expect it to pass, but it's an example of a piece of legislation that provides an opportunity to do education with the committee and the legislature. This is a bill on taxation, reparations, with the mechanism of funding it being taxing the endowments of institutions with endowments above $2 billion. The idea being you take an institution like Johns Hopkins University and Hospital, who have made billions of dollars off of the cells of Henrietta Lacks, for example, those cells that have been the basis for much of their medical experimentation, that serves as the basis for their prowess in that field. Just one of the many examples, Hopkins being a slave owner, right? All the ways that Hopkins benefits, the colonial relationship that Johns Hopkins has as the biggest employer in the state of Maryland, gives them an inordinate amount of power and control. And so them having an endowment, I believe last I looked, about $16 billion, that they're making money off of just having that wealth. With the reparative justice framework, it makes sense that those kinds of institutions are not entitled to the revenues from those endowments. And so we have a bill, the sponsor being Delegate Malcolm Ruff of the 41st District, who's also running for the state Senate seat in that district against Dahlia Attar. I'll talk about that briefly before I get to the next set of items. But Delegate Ruff is sponsoring that bill in the House. I need to look because it should have dropped by now, so I'll be able to have more details about its hearing. But it's important in the context of the Maryland Reparations Commission that was passed in the legislature. Governor vetoed, we overrode the veto. And so this commission, this is an example of the kind of legislative recommendations that a commission like the Maryland Reparations Commission would offer. And so this is just providing the committee an opportunity to have conversations, like real concrete policy conversations as to how you fund reparations in a realistic way. So I'm gonna say a little bit about Malcolm Ruff and the race in the 41st Legislative District. I mentioned that briefly only because, one of the things that is gonna come up in our conversation we bring on Andy is our approach to electoral politics. There is a cold war within the Democratic Party locally that is a hot war nationally between the moderate wing of the Democratic Party and the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And the moderate wing has been conservative on juvenile justice, issues of criminal justice, conservative on progressive taxation, right? Has hesitancy, in terms of reparations, which is why we had to have a whole fight with the governor and the legislature about it. So the Democratic Party, there's that war that's going on. And that race in the 41st District is particularly important because it is important for Black people in the state to send the message that we're not going to allow Zionists to drive the Democratic Party further to the center, producing policies that are going to continue to harm our community, right? So you'll hear more from us about that later on, but I just wanted to mention that because that will come up again when we have our conversation about electoral politics. And then lastly, just by way of update, one of the things that we're paying attention to are some of the immigration issues. So many of you may know that the House and Senate passed a bill that would ban 287G agreements, which would prohibit ICE agents from deputizing local law enforcement to carry out ICE law enforcement activity. And so that passed both the House and the Senate. It's my understanding they're waiting for the governor to sign it, and all indications are that the governor will sign it. And I think that's really important for the state of Maryland to send a message in terms of pushing back against the terror and brutality of ICE. Even when it doesn't result in fatalities, if we see in Minnesota, there are stories in Maryland of just folks being terrorized, people's family members being snatched. And so it's important. I think the legislature took a stand. There are other legislative items that are going to be important to move in addition to that piece of legislation. So what we don't want a situation where leadership gets behind banning 287G and then they think that's it, their job is done. There are going to be additional immigration bills, and we'll likely arrange a time for someone from CASA to talk folks through what those other initiatives are. I know one of them that I'll mention briefly is a bill around data privacy, that ICE has been able to go into state databases like the NBA to be able to get information, to show up at people's door and get people's information in order to do ICE enforcement. That federal government agency should not have access to all the data in state government. And it is a vital tool that ICE is using to carry out, its directives. We don't want to give them more ammunition to carry out its directives in the way that it's been harmful and disruptive to our community. So that is equally important, right? 287G and banning those contracts are important, but what is equally important is some of the other pieces of legislation that will come behind it that'll be extremely important. And we're going to need to make sure we press our elected officials, even though they did a good thing by banning 287G in the state of Maryland. There continues to be additional work that needs to be done to further protect our communities from the brutality and disruption of ICE. All right, so that is just a quick recap of our legislative priorities. Again, if you want a full explanation and analysis of our legislative priorities, go back to the first episode of our 2026 legislative session to get those. All right, so let's talk about LBS's approaches to electoral politics. So one of the things that has been a central feature of how LBS has operated is being clear that what's important for Black people as we navigate the political landscape is to operate as a power base and to be clear that even though Trump has taken the Republican Party in a much more explicit white nationalist fascist direction, we cannot allow that to create a political landscape where it lets the Democratic Party off the hook. The Democratic Party being a party that Black people have a exploitative relationship to, right? That at best, the Democratic Party panders to our community, panders to our collective interests. But there's certain kinds of issues that the Democratic Party won't budge on or won't advance because it would undermine the corporate, the white corporate dominated Democratic Party establishment that wants to maintain power, but also knows that electorally they need Black folks as a core part of their coalition to be electorally viable. And so what often happens is we get symbol over substance, we get liberal reform as opposed to revolutionary policy. I'll give two just quick examples of what this looks like. One example is that when you think about the Democratic Party, Black people being a core constituency, the Democratic Party would desire for its base to be more suburban voters, right? Because if Black people become the base of the Democratic Party, then there's certain things that would need to be addressed more directly, right? And an example of that, I mentioned like the automatic charge of youth as adults. This is a policy that we're talking about the criminalization of Black youth and the way that that criminalization then becomes weaponized against Black people, against Black leadership, but ultimately leads to Black youth experiencing dehumanization, often without much fanfare, right? Quietly, right? And there's a tacit acceptance of the dehumanization of Black youth, particularly those that are deemed violent, because it scares off that the constituency that's most impacted by this policy, white folks are afraid of, right? The kind of your typical white suburban, yoga instructor walking there, that they are afraid of these Black kids. And so for the Democratic Party to stand on and to say, this is something that we're going to focus on, it's the reason why it's taken so long for it to even get to a place where it's viable to move is as a result of the way that the Democratic Party wants to have Black folks, but doesn't want to alienate this white suburban base that doesn't have any interest in Black liberation or addressing the suffering of Black youth. Another example, we think about reparations, as I mentioned before. Reparations is something that is popular among Black folks, not popular amongst white folks, right? And the Democratic Party, I think, has begun to talk about reparations. But in terms of moving on reparations policies, right, this will require a level of infusion and capital and the capacity for sovereignty and self-determination for Black people the Democratic Party doesn't want, right? They want Black folks to continue to be subjects of, or continue to function as political and economic sharecroppers of white corporate power. That is what the Democratic Party prefers in terms of the way that Black people participate. So this is LBS's perspective generally on our approach to electoral politics, recognizing that we're navigating this existing duopoly, but understanding that if there is not a credible political threat to the left of the Democratic Party, then the Democratic Party is going to continue to have an exploitative relationship. So that is our approach to electoral politics. And so one of the things that we're going to spend our time talking about this evening is what is the utility of voting for a candidate in a race that likely won't win? Like, what is the walking people through the political utility of that, right? And talking about then how this translates to concrete policy objectives. So what I'm going to do, invite a person who's a friend of mine I've known for a long time. I'm going to invite Andy Ellis to join me on screen. And what I want to do first, hey, what's up, Andy?
Hey, Dayvon, how are you doing?
I'm good, man. Thanks for, agreeing to come on the platform. One of many conversations we've had over the years. So I tell you what, let's start with introducing yourself. I've alluded to the fact that we've known each other a long time. Introduce yourself, and as you do that, if you can give particular attention to how you have come to your awareness and familiarity with like revolutionary, particularly Black revolutionary political struggle. And so just introduce yourself, talk about that aspect of how you come in contact with that and how that shows up in your work now.
Yeah. So thank you so much. I'm excited to be on the show. I listen to it regularly, and I'm happy to be on this side of it instead of just listening. So thank you all for that. I appreciate that. My name is Andy Ellis. I'm running for governor as a Green Party candidate, and I have been doing work around alternatives to the two-party system here in Baltimore for about 10 years, where I've been part of the Green Party. I've been active in local races. I've been active in state races. I've been active in national and presidential races. Prior to that, I spent a lot of time coaching debate. I coached debate at Cal State Long Beach. I coached debate here at Towson. And my approach to that was always to figure out how to break down the binary that sort of defined white normed debate. And by breaking down that binary, the goal was always to expand the number of voices that were able to bring power and force into the debate round so that they could articulate a different vision of what was happening in the world, a different version of history, a different version of policy, and a different relationship to the United States federal government. So that was sort of where I got my training in this type of stuff. And we researched a lot of Black scholars, Black revolutionaries, Black internationalists. There was a whole series of deep research that we did on that, and that helped to inform me, and from a very pretty young age, to be reading scholarship and politics from Black revolutionary figures. So when I joined the Green Party in 2016 or in 2015, I looked around after the uprising and I realized that the people in the communities of Baltimore had solutions that weren't being listened to or implemented by the Democratic politicians. And it was going to be an election year in 2016, and there were a whole bunch of electeds out there talking about how they were going to solve this problem, but they were not willing to do anything nearly as radical as the people who were organizing in the streets, the people who were organizing in community. And that mismatch to me helped me to understand that one of the things that we needed to do was to break down what in Baltimore City is a one-party state that allows whoever wins the Democratic primary to be the one who holds the seat of power. I think I probably thought it was going to be easier than it is in 2016. But now, 10 years later, I have a really solid understanding of how that system works, what the points of vulnerability for that system are, and, what it is that people's opposition and fears about that kind of politics are, but also what people's wants of that politics are. So I hope that's the short version of it. But I mean, that is sort of the trajectory for how I got to here.
Mm-hmm. So let's jump right into it. So a lot of people, there's always this conversation around like pragmatism, right? So, you're engaging in politics. It's important to be clear about delivering materially for people, right? I know for LBS, it has been a priority of ours that in terms of how we engage politics, then in addition to having like a very revolutionary politics, also being engaged in politics that people can see the real material impact of the work that we've done, right? One of the things I know we're proud of is that we do have a pretty strong track record of things that people can see that have impacted the community in ways that people can be like, okay, that's what they're saying, and this is what that resulted in, right? I think we brought people along in terms of the possibilities of how you can comport yourself in the political landscape and achieve results. And so that's always been our perspective. Now, part of the challenge has been that for a lot of our community, people have only ever seen liberal democracy work. Like they've only seen reformists. That's the only thing they've seen with their own eyes, right? For the most part, with some exceptions, and I would say LBS is an exception, but for the most part, what they've seen is liberal reform. And so that creates a dynamic where people who see themselves as deeply caring about Black people, right, deeply caring about working class and other oppressed people, that they see operating within the duopoly as like an imperative if one is serious about delivering for the community. So addressing those who see third-party campaigns merely as spoilers, as like revolutionary fantasy land, right, as kind of intellectual and political purism, right? So the people who are operating from that vantage point that third party campaigns are merely just spoilers. If you can talk people through, like, what are the real material impacts that a campaign outside of the two-party duopoly, what are the ways that that campaign can effectively contribute to delivering for community and being into revolutionary politics?
Yeah, that's a great question. So whenever I talk about this question, the first thing I always want to do is to say that there's over 150 Greens who are holding elected office in the United States right now, and there's 1,500 Greens who have been elected through the course of our history over the last 30 years or so. So those folks are serving in the traditional way. They are running for office, getting elected, and serving their community. Now, that to me is not necessarily the answer to your question, but I think it's always worth grounding that there are people who are elected, and mostly municipal and small offices, but they're doing good work. They get reelected. People like them. So beyond that, though, the power to spoil is the actual power that third parties have in a two-party system. The power to threaten, to take away from the party that is most supposed to closely align with the values of the third party, to threaten their access to power is the power. That is how it works in a two-party system. And we'll talk about whether we actually have a two-party system or not later. I think there's a really good reframing on that. But for now, let's accept the premise. So I want to start here with the origin of the term spoiler. And according to Omar Ali, writing in a book called The Balance of Power, where he's writing about the way that third party movements have interacted with Black communities throughout American history, he says that the term originated in the 1844 election. And the 1844 election is a really interesting analog to look at when we're thinking about today. So you had the Whig Henry Clay, and the Democrat was James Polk, and they were both advocating for an expansion of slavery. They were both advocating, they had some quibble about whether we were going to annex Texas or whether we were going to invite Texas. They both had warlike tendencies as it related to Mexico. Also running in that race was a Liberty Party candidate named James Birney, and James Birney was running on an abolition platform in 1844. And so the Liberty Party's argument was both parties may not be the same, but they agree on the fundamental moral question of the time, which is the continuation of slavery. So in that race, New York is the swing state at the time. It has 36 electoral votes, and whoever wins it is going to win the election. It's a close election. It has by far the most electoral votes, and it's close. It had gone back and forth in the last couple of years. So Polk flips New York away from the Whigs, wins it for the Democrats, and he wins it by 5,100 votes, and the Liberty Party gets 1,500 votes, or 15,000 votes. So the Liberty Party is very clearly the difference between Polk being president and Clay being president. And most of those voters were white abolitionists and free Black folks who had the ability to vote at the time, according to the way that Omar Ali narrates the story. And what the Whigs do after that, instead of taking the check to say, oh, we lost because we supported slavery, they start attacking the Liberty Party as spoilers. And according to Omar Ali, this is the first time that there's a historical record of the term coming into existence. So if we start there and we understand that moment, everybody who voted for the Liberty Party in New York and anywhere else in the country understood that they weren't going to win. They understood that the stakes were high. They understood that if Polk won, there was going to be a war with Mexico because he had promised it, and that there was going to be an expansion of slavery because he had promised it. Yet a bunch of white abolitionists and free Black folks still voted that way because they weren't going to vote for either party that believed in slavery. So what happens after that is pretty interesting. The Whig Party goes away, and we enter into a multi-party era in Congress. So during most of the 1850s, there are multiple parties that exist in Congress at that point. Now, look, the 1850s are a pretty bad time, and the destabilization of the Democratic Party is probably pretty bad. But following the intellectual and political lineage of the Liberty Party, you get a Republican Party. Lincoln gets elected. There's a Civil War, and then there's Reconstruction, right? And so this is the most clear example, and it is the origin story of the term, of where that vote outside of the two-party system fundamentally changes the course of the nation, and probably is a pretty revolutionary act in that case.
So real quick, tease out the 15,000 that made it so that Polk wins, and so connect that to, because my sense that I'm getting is that you're saying that helps to create the context for the emergence of a Republican Party that then can push for it. So if you just draw that more tightly.
Yeah. So the Liberty Party is a radical abolitionist party, and they are running on a radical abolition perspective, and they are classically spoilers. In the swing state, they get more than the margin, and they get more than the margin of voters, and they flip the state. Those voters had previously voted. They probably would have voted Democrat, or would have voted Whig, but for there being an abolition party on the ballot that is making a strong case that both parties may not be the same, but they agree. And so it's classically how we would look at it. It's way clearer of an example than anything that we see in modern times. It is very much, white abolitionists and free black folks who were voting, according to Omar Ali, that knew what they were doing, right? And they were doing it on purpose. And the result of it was it killed the Liberty Party, because the pressure that came on the Liberty Party after that, there were a lot of people who agreed with them who thought that having Polk win was the worst of two evils. And so the pressure on them really split up the party. But when the party split up, it created the Free Soil Party, and it created a series of other parties that sort of contested with how to deal with the abolition question. And it took about a decade for the Republicans to emerge out of that as the legitimized alternative. Now, by the time we get there, the Republicans are nowhere near the abolitionists that Birney was, and that the Liberty Party was, but they're inheriting a lot of members. They're inheriting a lot of people who had previously been elected, who had previously been in the Liberty Party, and they're becoming the third party at that point. And so, it is at that point that the Whig newspaper and propaganda machine starts labeling them as spoilers, but it didn't work. The Whigs killed the Whigs. They won one presidency after that, but they didn't have any electoral votes within two elections. And it destabilized and realigned the coalitions of power at the time. So that's that. And then I think the next thing to understand is there's a book by a guy named Haynes Walton about black political parties. And what Haynes Walton is talking about is black political parties in the South from Reconstruction until about 1970. And what he argues is that at the state level, there were all sorts of black political parties that emerged at various different points during this time period in order to contest when black folks had the ability to vote, to contest black folks sort of being aligned with one party almost exclusively. Throughout history of much of the South, black folks were aligned with one party exclusively, and they largely were disempowered as a result of that in ways that they are similar to now. Haynes Walton chronicles this history of black folks who decided to break free from the dominant party that black folks aligned with and challenge that party's power by threatening third-party runs, by using the power to take away votes in order to get concessions. And there's a whole bunch of really interesting history in there leading up to the sort of end of the period that Haynes Walton is writing about. But at the end of the period that he's writing about, he talks about a guy named James Clyburn, who, many of us are aware of James Clyburn. James Clyburn was upset. James Clyburn and other HBCU folks were upset at the way that the Democratic Party in South Carolina was neglecting black voters, wasn't nominating black candidates, and was ensuring that black folks were second-class citizens in the party that they were involved in. So we're looking at 1968. The United Citizens Party forms in South Carolina. And the United Citizens Party does a ballot drive with a bunch of civil rights workers and HBCU students, gets on the ballot, and they run candidates and they elect the first candidates to the South Carolina General Assembly, first Black candidates to the South Carolina General Assembly since Reconstruction on an independent ballot line. This forces the Democratic Party to understand that they can't keep doing this, or they're going to continue having these contested elections, and there's going to be a Black party challenging them. And so in that instance, you get this instance where at the state level, it's not the national level, not the presidential level, but at the state level, the unique conditions of state politics facilitate this place where the threat to leave the party, to go in or to go out of the party, gives leverage to Black folks who want the party to behave differently. And I mean, I think this is also, it's useful to understand that when Fannie Lou Hamer got back from the convention in Chicago, they left the Democratic Party and ran as independents. And the Mississippi, in Mississippi, they played that line of in or out, and that was where their power came from. If they said always in, they didn't have the power in order to get concessions out of the Democratic Party. But if they threatened to leave, they had the power in order to get concessions out of it. Now, it's a slow, arduous process. It wasn't magical revolution overnight or anything. But what it does say is that that's how power works. What do political parties fear other than losing votes and losing power? And so when people say, you're a spoiler, for too long, the Green Party in particular, and a lot of parties on the left have tried to run away from that and say, oh, no. All we want to do is provide choices, or all we want to do is provide ideas. My thinking about this is if you are not trying to change outcomes by threatening the existing power structure, then that is not revolutionary work. That is reformist work at best, and kind of neoliberalism of the worst kind, to just say we are doing all this so people have more choices. We've got to be honest that in close elections, our presence can change the outcome, and we have to use that responsibly in order to change outcomes in line with the values that I have and that we share with LBS on a lot of these things. So I'll stop there for a second, but I want to talk about the context of that's a lot of history, but that history is, I think, useful. But I do want to talk about it in the Maryland context, but I want to stop there and see if you
Well, because I definitely want to ask you to speak more in depth contemporaneously about the mechanics of how, and I'll add to it. What I want to do, I'll actually add another historical example that's Maryland specific. That Maryland, there was efforts amongst free Black people in Maryland in the 1860s and 70s to bar for Black people to practice law, right? For Black people to participate, and because there was Harvey Johnson, who was the pastor of Union Baptist, who himself was a Pan-Africanist, kind of before the turn of kind of pro-Pan-Africanist. He understood the importance of using litigation as a way of testing the laws of 13th Amendment, 14th, 15th Amendment, and some of the changes to the Maryland Constitution. And so part of the challenge, though, was that the judiciary, the judges, would never rule when they were trying to make a legal case to allow Black lawyers to practice and to be barred, that the judges, they always ruled against them. And so Harvey Johnson actually organized with a group of disgruntled Democrats and independents. So at the time, Republicans, the equivalent of the Democrats are today, organized in order to get a slate of judges elected, right, that weren't loyal to either side. And what that resulted in, so Maryland, Everett Waring being the first Black person to be barred and practice law in Maryland, came as a result of free Black people deciding to vote with disgruntled Democrats and independents against the Republican Party that was not going to support the initiatives they wanted in terms of electing judges that would commit to giving Black people rights. And so they were able to organize and get a new slate of judges elected who themselves weren't necessarily committed to racial justice or anything like that, but they were independent enough where they didn't have the allegiance to the Republican Party, right, which created an incentive for them to rule in contexts where it made sense to rule against what the Republican Party establishment would want. And so there are a bunch of changes in terms of the use of litigation as a strategy in the late 1800s for free Black people. That was made possible in part because of an approach to electoral politics where they did not go with the traditional Republican Party line that, you know, they were kind of pressured to engage in there. And there were a lot of contested conversations within the Black community about whether or not that was acceptable. Why would you defect from a party, you know, the party of Lincoln, right? So some of the pressure that, you know, Black folks receive now from Democrats, particularly Black ones that are highly placed, to say, oh, you know, you're putting in jeopardy the little bit of progress that we do have, understanding that they saw it in their interests to use that leverage, that spoiler, to use that leverage, you know, to create an environment where they would then be able to force the Republican Party to allow Black folks to practice law in the state of Maryland. So you know, these are examples of the way that folks have sophisticated analysis of using the ballot outside of the traditional duopoly that's imposed on us. Go ahead.
So, you know, I mean, I think what this points at is that the United States has actually always been a multi-party country. And we have always had multiple parties. There have been two dominant ones at almost every point, but there have almost always been challenges to that two-party system. And so in the 1950s, the American Political Science Association released a treatise called sort of Toward a Responsible Two-Party System. And what they argue there is that the threats to the post-war American vision that came from outside of the two dominant parties, and I think what they mean there is, you know, folks that are fighting for civil rights, folks that are fighting for Black internationalism, socialism, and labor movements, that those things are a threat to post-war progress. So they issue this sort of orienting document that says we need to have a responsible two-party system in which we have two non-ideological parties who work together to compromise and have nationalized infrastructure, have nationalized elections, have nationalized identities. Most of the political science establishment agrees with that. Most of the legal establishment agrees with that. And within a couple of years, you see the lowest period of third-party activity in a long time. And it is because they understand the history that you're talking about, that Haynes Walton is talking about, that happens before. And so they are trying, in the means of preserving the post-war moment where American hegemony and imperialism and white power can grow, they're trying to preserve that by locking in a two-party system. And so it is a relatively new invention to have it work like it does right now. And it was a response to what they felt was probably legitimately a threat to the ability to have a two-party consensus about imperialism, about racial progress, and about capitalism, and about an approach to the globe. And so I think it's really important to understand that we have almost always had those challenges, and Black folks have been at the forefront of leading those efforts in order to challenge the system because of, you know, exactly the type of conditions that you're talking about, where the party that is supposed to support Black folks takes their votes for granted and then serves a white power base. You know, and so I think the thing that is most fascinating for me is when you start to dig into this, you start to understand that there are examples everywhere. There have always been examples, and there are always people who understand that the binary isn't serving them and have tried to break out of it, and that this relatively modernized structure that is a post-war invention of nationalized parties that make sure that nothing can do that was a response to the threat that posed to the system that we have today. And it was effective. It effectively clamped down on that type of resistance for a very long time.
Mm. And a few moments ago, I know that you wanted to talk more about the Maryland context in terms of the use of third parties as leverage and spoilers. You want to go ahead and do that?
Yeah. So I think it's really useful to think about this as it relates to the governor's race, the one that I'm running in right now, and with two different scenarios. One scenario was the scenario where Larry Hogan ran, and Larry Hogan was an effective candidate, and it was going to be a close race. I think we had some idea that could be the case for quite a while until Larry Hogan withdrew. And in that scenario, it would have been an election about spoiling. It would have been an election about threatening to spoil if Wes Moore did not sign a 287G agreement. If Westmore vetoed something that would have curtailed data centers coming into Black communities, if Westmore vetoed reparations, right? Like, it would have been a threat to be able to say, you know, if you do that, there are people who are not going to vote for you, and you risk not getting elected again, because Hogan has a chance in this close election. So that's one scenario, and I think we have to be very clear-eyed when we enter into this, that is a possible outcome of these types of things, and be very responsible and grounded in community to understand how we're wielding that power. It's real power. We have a ballot line, and it has the potential to change the outcome. We have to be responsible about how we wield that power. And if that had been the
and
way,
real quick on that, because I want to punctuate that point, because what you just said is something that I don't think a lot of people here, leftists who want radical approaches to electoral politics, say, which is that there is a responsibility in wielding the power of being the spoiler,
right?
And that taking that seriously, because I think there's a caricature out there where it's like, oh, these are just like academic, college dorm conversation, as opposed to like real, political consideration. And I know that, I know we're in a different scenario, right? We're not in the scenario, the Hogan scenario. But I just, if you could just say a little bit more about like that responsibility part of it, because I think it's important for our listeners to hear someone who in your position reflect on that in a serious way, as opposed to the caricature, which is like, oh, they all the same, it don't matter. You know what I mean?
Right. And so you'll never hear me say the parties are the same. You will hear me say the parties agree on a lot of things. And so I think like three places where Westmore and the Freedom Caucus agree are really useful to point out. And the Freedom Caucus is the far right-wing Republicans who basically could be their own party if they wanted to, in a sense. But three places where they agree. One, they agree on the veto on reparations. And I think there needs to be a challenge to that agreement on that. And I think there needs to be responsibility for a politician who is going to veto a reparations bill in a state with the largest Black caucus in the country, and with a history of a truncated Reconstruction that needs to be repaired. Right. So that's one example. The other is 287G agreements. It's great that they're going to pass it this year and he's going to sign it this year. But last year that bill got killed at the last minute in the by Bill Ferguson. And that killing of the 287G agreement ban last year means that there's a whole lot of families in Maryland right now who have a person who got caught up in a 287G agreement and deported, maybe to a concentration camp in El Salvador, and maybe somewhere else that they've never been before, who Bill Ferguson and the Democratic Party should be responsible to explaining why they drag their feet when they have a supermajority and they have control of every constitutional office. And there has to be somebody who is going to responsibly use that argument to challenge folks in power, to make them understand that there are consequences to doing things like this to working families in Maryland. The third example is data centers. And this is becoming a really important issue because data centers, like all other industry, is getting sited in poor and working class, Black, brown, and rural neighborhoods. And when they come in, they have not just effects on the energy grid, but they have effects on water. They have polluting effects. They have sound problems. They have emissions. And both the Freedom Caucus and Westmore agree that the solution to the energy problem is to put fracked gas plants next to the data centers. So what they agree on is that not only should there be a data center in a place like Landover or in a place like Randallstown, but that there should be a gas plant next to it as well that has a fast-tracked regulatory pathway. I think that when the Democratic governor is agreeing with the far-right Freedom Caucus on that, there needs to be somebody who can strategically focus on that in the race to take away votes from them if they don't change their position. Now, he might not have, if that had been the case, he might not have changed his position. But he would have faced consequences from that, and he would have faced voters who would not have been supporting him and would have been supporting us because we were taking the positions that aligned with their communities and aligned with their safety. And I think that's a very real way to wield this power. When Green Party and other third party candidates don't have this type of analysis about the power that they have and the responsibility they have to the people they say they're working for, they're unfortunately both hapless and reckless. They think that they can't get anything done, but they also don't feel like they're responsible for the bad consequences. And we need to understand that if our goal is to change outcomes by using the power of our ballot line in order to threaten to spoil, that we're responsible for those outcomes. And like that has to be ground truth, or it has to be how we start this analysis if we're serious about using it in order to advance values that we care about for people that we care about.
No, I'm glad I think that analysis and perspective, I think is important, particularly for those who are on the left, who are wanting more radical approaches to electoral politics, to be grounded in that assessment, right? That if you're engaged in political contestation, you're responsible for the consequences, and you have to be able to defend, right, the nature of those consequences and what that means for the larger society. So I think that's really important to lay out.
Yeah, and you have to be intentional about it. You can't have it both ways. You can't be like, we didn't affect the outcome. We're not here to do any. You have to understand, if you change the outcome, you have responsibility for that. Now, it's not sole responsibility, right? Like, right? I've been giving a speech recently that is called "Ralph Nader Was Right" about a lot of things. And Ralph Nader has some responsibility potentially for the results that came about. There's Greens who will disagree with me, and we can talk about how many votes in Florida. Ralph does not have sole responsibility, but he doesn't have no responsibility, right? There's a lot of people who have more responsibility than he does, but it seems ridiculous to me to think that you can run an election, get votes, and not have responsibility for the consequences of getting those votes. And that to me just feels like a very unserious way to approach these questions that is rooted in a neoliberal escapism that is just about choices, that isn't about outcomes. It has to be about outcomes.
Yeah. And I'm going to give two examples of things that I think help to illustrate the point. In 2014, we had a gubernatorial election. Then Lieutenant Governor, now the Attorney General, Anthony Brown, who was the Democratic nominee for governor, and at that time, little known Larry Hogan, the Republican nominee. I know a bunch of people who, because of Martin O'Malley and just the toxicity that comes with Martin O'Malley, were like, they're just going to vote for Hogan, just as a way to shove it to the Democratic Party. Now, I want to be clear to the audience, to those listening, like, I would never advocate for people to vote for Republicans for the purpose of using it as leverage against the Democratic Party. But I'm using it as an example because when Larry Hogan won, I remember one of the first things the party did, that the legislature did, our Democratic supermajority, was that they put in a bill that allowed those who are formerly incarcerated to vote upon release. And I remember, I think the number was like there were 40,000 new voters that it would attract. This is something that, again, people like then Delegate Jill Carter, I know Doc Cheatham, who used to be at the NAACP. Like, I know folks who have been working on those kind of issues for years during the O'Malley administration. But Anthony Brown loses, the Democrats lose the governor's mansion. The Democratic Party then puts in a bill that allows those formerly incarcerated to vote upon release, not because they have a newfound appreciation for those who are formerly incarcerated, because those are likely Democratic Party voters for them to take back the governor's mansion. Hogan vetoes it, and the legislature overrides the veto to ensure these new voting rights. So I say that in this context to say to people, there are examples of when Democrats face consequences that then result in them having to come further in the direction of our community to deliver policies that they otherwise would not have had they not had the electoral consequences of losing, in terms of them then legislating in a way that is in the direction of the kinds of policies they were looking for. Conversely, the 2018 gubernatorial candidate for governor, Ben Jealous, who, people may have criticism, some people don't like him or whatever. His platform was I would say, the most progressive platform of a Democratic nominee for governor, at least, in the last, in the 21st century, right, in Maryland, the most progressive policy platform. And the Democratic Party establishment took a knee. The Democratic Party established. I remember seeing Democrats for Hogan. There was a whole thing of Democrat senators for Hogan, right? And so for all those that say, well, you got to work within the Democratic Party, and that if you push the Democratic Party further left, right, then the party's going to move with it. Like all those people that give excuses as to why we shouldn't have credible alternatives to the left of the Democratic Party, to me, that election was a great example of why we cannot rely on the Democratic Party itself to be a vehicle to deliver progressive policy, because they had an opportunity, right? And he won the primary against Rashawn Baker, who was a establishment Democratic figure. So the voters in the Democratic primary, and this goes to your point in terms of those whose political views are not represented in the two-party system, even when it is expressed in a Democratic primary, right? The Democratic Party ensured that Ben Jealous wouldn't have won the election. So to me, those are examples of, like, both on the first example, consequences do make them change their political behavior in our direction. And that if we are so reliant on working within the party, then we're going to get outcomes like what happened to Ben Jealous, in 2018. And so that leads me to our conversation about HB 101.
Yep.
Because I think part of the challenge is that not enough. I have often imagined, like, the explanation that you've given about the importance of third parties, like having that on the debate stage, right, for the general public to hear, because there are very rarely opportunities that people get to hear this explanation in a mainstream political context that would be of consequence. And so for those, I've mentioned it before, HB 101 would require that any entity receiving state dollars, that is a public broadcaster, that if they convene a statewide general election debate, they have to invite everybody that is on the ballot. For LBS's purposes, our perspective being that it creates an opportunity to hold the Democratic Party accountable to its left, to help enhance that credible threat to the left of the Democratic Party, for them to hear these ideas in ways that they otherwise wouldn't. I don't want to spend a bunch of time talking necessarily about, like, the benefits of the policy on its face, because we've done that in previous episodes of the podcast. But I want to focus particularly on the hearing that was had on the bill in the House last week, where, we presented, it was a panel of us, we presented our perspectives on it, and the primary resistance to it. Many of the legislators who would say, yeah, we'd love to debate you all, right? But they say that there's a potential constitutional challenge with moving the bill. So if you can start by just walking through, like, the explanation from their vantage point of what the constitutional challenges are, and then if you can say a little bit about how we would refute those challenges that were raised in the hearing.
Yeah. So I think I think that's a really good segue to this. And I will say that the opposition came from the people who represent the broadcasters, from trade groups and lobbyists, and they cited constitutional problems without ever explaining what the constitutional problems were, even though the fiscal note had mentioned one case, and they didn't mention that. So I found it interesting that they did not take the argument on face that there is a need to have more people on the stage. They simply said, you can't make us do that. And Delegate Stewart raised a Supreme Court case called FCC versus League of Women Voters that was decided in 1984. And he felt pretty confident that case was directly applicable to this and made this bill unconstitutional. Now, we submitted a reply to him recently that sort of tries to reframe that a little bit, but I think it's important to understand what that case was about. So what that case was about was a blanket ban on editorializing for all public broadcasters. There was a law that had said you cannot editorialize if you were a public broadcaster. And the court struck that down as an overly broad restriction on speech because it banned a whole category of speech, editorializing. But what it did find was that there were certain ways that the legislatures could interact with public broadcasters as long as it served a broader public good. And so I actually think that that case that Delegate Stewart is citing is an example. HB 101 is the kind of legislation that would be would be credible under that. It's narrow, it's tailored, and it serves a specific public interest. It is not a ban on editorializing. It is in fact a very narrowly tailored thing to advance a specific state interest. So that's one part of it. The second part of it is that when Maryland Public Television was established, when the Maryland Public Broadcasting System was established by the state of Maryland in 1966, there was written into the statute something that described it as having a mandate that prohibited presenting biased or one-sided aspects of partisan politics or advocating or opposing any present or prospective political candidacy. And our argument is that the way that public television excludes a whole class of parties, non-principal parties exist as a class of parties in the state of Maryland, and they are the parties like Greens, Libertarians, Working Class Party. If you deem a People's Progress Party gets on the ballot, they will be non-principal parties. But the way that Maryland Public Television operates right now, they exclude a whole class of legally defined parties in the state of Maryland. So our argument back to this is that not only is HB 101 the kind of remedy that the court was saying is acceptable in FCC, it is also enforcing a statute that exists. Now, it's important to also know here that Maryland Public Television is not like PBS. They are not like a side, like a side nonprofit that gets some funds. They are, according to their own policies, an agency of the state of Maryland. So, I think one really interesting question here would be, who would have standing if the legislature were to come down and say that they had to include everybody on the debate stage? Could Maryland Public Television, as an agency of the state by their own identification, sue the legislature? I think that's a really good question, right? The legislature established this state agency. They already have editorial control over that prohibits them from doing certain things. And HB 101 is enforcement of that original legislation and that original language that has never changed since it was instilled in 1966. There were three pieces of legislation, I think in 66, 67, and 69, that all tinkered with this, and they all left it the same under governors of both parties. So that's the first part of it, is FCC versus League of Women Voters. And I think absolutely the way that it was framed in the hearing is favorable to the lobbyists, but not favorable to at least our reading of the Constitution in that case. The second case, which is mentioned in the fiscal note, is a case called Arkansas Educational Television versus Forbes. And this was decided in 1988. And in this case, Forbes, who was a third-party candidate, sued for not being included in a debate. And the Supreme Court ruled that sued on First Amendment grounds and said the First Amendment requires him to be allowed into the debate. The Supreme Court said it does not. The First Amendment gives them the latitude to be able to choose reasonable sets of standards that are about who participates in a debate. And the court said in the majority opinion that legislators would be able to set neutral standards about who was in the debate. So again, that case also, I think, indicates that HB 101 is exactly the kind of policy solution that would have been considered viable under that. Now, that was a 6-3 decision, and it is worth noting that all three of the dissent agreed with that, and it was part of the majority decision, right? So what we have here is two cases that define this kind of thing that are being cited, one by the lobbyist and Delegate Stewart and one in the fiscal note. And I will say the fiscal note does not say it is unconstitutional according to this. It just brings this case up. And what both of those cases suggest is that a legislature, especially in a place where it is regulating a state agency, have the ability to set reasonable standards to enforce things like not discriminating, not having, political bias in the programming of that. And our argument would be...
So let me, just a couple of things I want you to tease out. One is that, because a lot of people don't know the process of how a party gets on the ballot. So that's one of the things that we argue is that, like you said, it's an objective criteria, right? So it's not a criteria that's one about perspective on who you think makes the most substantive dialogue for the public politically,
Right.
but it's an objective measure. So if you could say a little bit about like getting on the ballot and how, you know, that being an objective measure. And then one of the things that I know we talked about before was this distinction you make between nonpartisan and bipartisan, and why that particular framing is important in thinking about moving past the constitutional concerns.
Yeah, and so let me start here with a story that is really helpful for me about how I approach this. So in September of 2024, LBS had a panel about question H, and it was myself, Josh Harris, Delegate Wells, and Senator Sidnor. And I kept saying, we have a two-party system, because that is how I've come to accept it. And when I was talking to Senator Sidnor afterwards, he said, we don't have a two-party system. You're here, you're on the ballot, you exist, right? Like, we have a system that has multiple parties in it. And at first, I didn't really appreciate what he was saying. But I think what he was saying is so important to understand about how we approach this question, because the General Assembly has created laws that allow there to be parties outside of Democrats and Republicans in Maryland. They very explicitly have identified ballot access laws, and we'll talk about those in a second, that allow parties to get on the ballot that are not Democrats and Republicans. It's so explicit that they have two classes of parties that are described in statute. There are principal parties, which are the Democrats and Republicans, and non-principal parties, which have a whole set of laws that apply to them. So what Senator Sidnor is saying is that we have a multi-party system. And my addition to that is we have a multi-party system, but a system that only allows two parties to be healthy and have elected office. And so if we have that understanding when we think about this question, then we can look at the criteria that MPT sets up to determine who gets in the debate. And that criteria includes 10% polling in a credible statewide poll. That might make sense in some abstract sense, but it is not contextual to Maryland history, where no party since Reconstruction outside of the two parties has gotten 10%. They have got, the highest amount was 9.88 from Hyman Pressman in 1966. He was the sitting comptroller of the city of Baltimore. He had been elected. He was an elected official, right? The highest third party performance, the highest partisan performance outside of the two parties was 3.2% in 1895, right? And so when Maryland Public Television sets a threshold at 10%, they are excluding a whole class of statutorily recognized parties de facto, and so their argument is that the Supreme Court has said that those type of standards are acceptable. Our argument is that does not account for the unique situation of Maryland, where the public agency, or where public television is established by statute and already has prohibitions on what they can do. So the lobbyists will say, well, we allow both parties, but both parties is bipartisan. It is not partisan, because there's a whole class of parties established in Maryland law that are excluded by the current standard. Then one other thing I will say here is, a lot of times when these cases come to courts, public broadcasters will say, well, would you have us put people on the debate stage who are, talking about chemtrails, spewing sedition, and lying regularly? And I think the interesting thing, if we look at what happened in 2022, and what's probably likely to happen in 2026, is that is a description of the Republican candidate. Dan Cox talks regularly about chemtrails, literally. He sent a bus to January 6th, and he lies regularly. And so their argument about the quality of the content that they are using, that they're protecting via these are so-called neutral standards, is actually turned on its head when you look at the people that they're allowing in and at the people that they're excluding.
So with that, and so I think that's really helpful context. And again, for the listeners, this is going to be an important part of the analysis that we give to the committee in order to push, the piece of legislation through. So then let's transition then to talk about, and you've already kind of started to talk about, what does multi-party democracy looks like in Maryland. And I know you were going to mention, ballot access and what it takes to get ballot access. So if you can incorporate that into, like, in the bigger picture. So, you got the campaign for governor 2026, but there's a bigger picture in terms of multi-party democracy in Maryland. So if you can lay out the connection between, like, your race for governor, and then how do we get to a place where Maryland is truly a healthy kind of multi-party political electoral system?
Yeah, and so one of the things that I very much understand, coming from a history that is well studied in Black revolutionary thought and Black political thought, is that the people who are doing any particular piece of work are not necessarily the people who will always benefit from that work. Plenty of generations of folks have fought for freedoms and liberties that they never had the opportunity to experience, but the work was important. And I think if we look at where we started with the Liberty Party example, it's a pretty good example of it. The Liberty Party was decimated as a result of breaking through the two-party system and spoiling at that point, but it spawned other opportunities that allowed a broader approach to it. So I want to start there and say that what we are doing is in that tradition and is in that spirit. And I would love it. I've been a Green for 10 years, and I think Greens have been active in Maryland for 25 years. We're one of the most active state parties in the country. And I would love it if we, get to have some folks elected. I think myself really enjoy I'm one of the folks who would enjoy, days long hearings and like the minutia of bills and things like that. I'd love it if I could be a delegate. Right. But I don't know that that's going to happen for the Green Party at any point. It may or it may not. But I just say that to say that in 10 years of doing this, I've gotten to really understand what the levers of power are that stop those parties from being healthy. And tomorrow is a day where a lot of these things are going to be being heard in that same committee. So I want to go through a couple of things here that are really specific policy pieces in place in Maryland right now that stop small parties from being able to be healthy, attract members, and gain power. One of them is ballot access. So the way that ballot access works in the state of Maryland is that for a small party to become a new party that is registered in the state and is able to have voters register and is able to run candidates, you have to collect 10,000 petition signatures and turn them in and have them be valid. Now, these are on paper forms where handwriting is used in order to, write out the name. So if you've ever been at a farmer's market and you got some groceries in one hand and a dog in the other and a kid in tow, and somebody says, hey, can you sign this petition? You might be like, yeah, sure, whatever. I believe in more democracy. You're going to scribble it out. And if you don't write very clearly your full name, your address exactly, date the right things, date this and the other, it's going to get thrown out. Sheila Dixon's signature got thrown out on a petition that she signed a couple of years ago because of some technicality that was involved in it. And so about 30% of petition signatures on these paper forms that are in handwriting get thrown out. And that's an astounding number. Now, not every one of those folks is a legitimate voter, legitimately expressing their interest, but some decent subset of them are. Right. And so you have legitimately registered voters who have made a paperwork error potentially, or who just don't have clear handwriting, who are having their expression that a new party should be on the ballot. They're having those thrown out. So there's a bill that Delegate Ruth has sponsored for the last couple of years and Senator Carter sponsored a couple of years ago called the Ballot Petition Modernization Act. And what this does is it builds on the experience that we had during the COVID state of emergency, where we were able to work with the State Board of Elections in order to allow electronic petition signatures. And so during the COVID state of emergency, they said, you can't be within 6 feet of other people. All public events are canceled. And we said, hold on, the Constitution requires us to get these signatures. So we were able to get these regulations that allowed people to go to a website, sign a petition, and have it be counted and valid. Delegate Ruth's bill would make that permanent. It would also make it so that there were reasonable standards about how names got evaluated. So my name is Andy Ellis. That's what I go by my whole life. My first name is really Stephen. And if I wrote Andy Ellis on there instead of Stephen Ellis, that would be thrown out. That's a reasonableness standard that is pretty unreasonable and is pretty much targeted at non-principal parties. In states like New Jersey and Massachusetts, where Democrats and Republicans also have to collect signatures in order to get on the ballot, those rules are much more lax. Andy would be acceptable in most of those cases because Democrats and Republicans don't want their signatures thrown out. In a state like Maryland, where Democrats and Republicans don't have to collect those signatures, they have paper forms with arcane standards. The third piece of that they have is there's no curing. So when Sheila Dixon's got thrown out, then when she signed the petition for the red line in 2022, the sponsors were not able to go and reach out to her and say, Sheila Dixon, can you please come and dot this I and cross this T, so that they would accept it. Delegate Ruth's bill would make that change as well. This would make it easier for small parties to get on the ballot by mobilizing their supporters. There's about a 90% validation rate with electronic signatures versus about a 70% validation rate with paper signatures. That means that we can spend less money and less time petitioning to get on the ballot. And it's a pretty easy modern reform that would make sense. And the only reason that it stays the way that it is because there's not a lot of interest in the General Assembly, or has not been until recently. This may be the year. There's not a lot of interest in making that easier, right? They don't want challengers to the laws that they put up. They don't want other people supporting laws like charter amendments, and they don't want independent and third-party candidates. It's really not as much about independent and third-party candidates. They're not actually that worried about it, but it gets caught up in the same thing. So that's ballot access. It would be really easy to make it easier to get ballot access. Keeping ballot access requires 1% in the governor's race or 1% in the president's race. And this is the case in about 35 states. And so if you think about all these times when people say, why are Greens running in this state or that state? It's because Democrats and Republicans have put ballot access standards in place that say they have to run in those races in order to secure ballot lines for down ballot tickets. So if I get 1% in the governor's race, somebody can walk into the Baltimore City Board of Elections and file as a Green in early 2027. If I don't get 1% in the governor's race, Green Party again has to collect 10,000 signatures, and 70% of them are going to be valid. So that's ballot access. Do you want to stop there, or do you want me to keep going through the list?
Let's stop there for that part.
Okay.
So I think, because a part of what I would extrapolate from what you've said, those are just examples of the kinds of things that would help to facilitate healthier multi-party political activity, in Maryland.
That's one of them.
Yeah.
So.
And so what I want to do then is, because I know you said you have till 7:30, but I actually have a hard stop at 7.
Okay.
And so with the last, let's say for the next 5 minutes, do the other stuff you have, but let's see if you can do it within the next 5 minutes.
Yeah, sure. So we already talked about public broadcasting. Beyond allowing debate access on public broadcasting, I think we should allow ballot qualified parties to have access to public broadcasting to make political commentary like parties in the UK do, parties in Canada do. So many people have seen the success of the Green Party in the UK recently with Zach Polanski, and have seen some great videos. Part of that is because they can use BBC facilities in order to make videos and broadcast those videos. They have a show for the recognized political party to go on the public television station and have political talk. That's one of the things that I think we could expand to make it more likely that we had healthy parties. The second one is public financing, and there's going to be a bill about this tomorrow. I'm running as a publicly financed candidate for the governor's race. If I raise $120,000 from 1,500 Marylanders, I qualify for $600,000 to $700,000. That's nowhere near the $8 million that Wes Moore has right now, but at least it makes it more likely that we can hire people and compete. If we could have public financing for all small party candidates and it was easy for them to qualify, it would challenge the resource problems that really are at the core of it. There's a guy named Bernard Tomas who studies this stuff. He's at Valdosta State University, and he makes the argument that third parties are stuck in a vicious cycle of not being able to build resources because they're seen as unable to win, and unable to increase their voter support because they can't raise resources. And if we can figure out how to use public financing for candidates in those parties in order to get the resources, we get to a place where they can be more competitive. The last thing I'll say is proportional representation. Proportional representation allocates the seats based on the proportion that a party gets in the vote. So right now we have 3-member seats in the House of Delegates. And if we had a thing where right now we have this thing where you vote for 3 people, and you know, the Democrats always win in the blue spots and the Republicans always win in the red spots. Under a proportional representation system, you'd vote for Democrat, Republican, Green. There's a lot of different ways to do it. But if the Democrats got 66% of the vote and the Ujima People's Progress Party got 1/3 of the vote, they'd get one of the seats. This is the most fundamental way to challenge who's actually in power, is proportional representation. There's a bill tomorrow also about ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting is good for voters. It's not particularly good for third parties. But we as Greens have supported it because it's good for voters and it's good for the system, not because it's good for us. And so those things, ballot access, public financing, public broadcasting, those are the things that allow people to get their message out better and to have more appeal to folks. And then proportional representation is the real electoral reform that would allow us to move toward a multi-party system where multiple parties were in power. Once you get that, then you start to see dynamics change in Annapolis, because coalitions can form and coalitions can be realigned. There may be some things where the DSA supported folks and the Freedom Caucus folks agree on some things. And if they are able to cross party lines to a place where they can realign coalitions, even if there's a supermajority, things begin to change, you know? And so those are really, and a lot of these have hearings tomorrow. So, you know, if folks are interested on our show on Thursday night, go green, youtube.com, go green 2026. We'll be talking about all of these pieces of legislation that have hearings tomorrow, and really diving into how they help with to create a multi-party system in Maryland. But I think the last thing I'll say on this is the work that we are doing here is to make people understand, is to help people understand not only that it is possible and, or not only that it is desirable to have a third party or to have multiple parties that are healthy and in power, but that it is possible and that there are policy solutions that can be taken by the General Assembly right now in order to make it more likely that a working families party, for example, could thrive here in Maryland, or a Green Party could thrive, or a Ujima People's Progress Party, or the Freedom Caucus could split off and become the Freedom Party and challenge the Republicans in some of those places. If we did that, voters would have more responsive politicians, and politicians would more likely feel the need to be accountable to communities and voters, and coalitional power would change in Annapolis, and it would be an entirely different day where folks who are on the left side of the Democratic Party or on the right side of the Republican Party are not marginalized, but they have the ability to actually wield power in order to get outcomes that benefit their communities.
Well, look, you know, one of many conversations we've had over the years. Appreciate you coming on. I think, you know, we're going to continue, LBS is going to continue to, you know, support, you know, your candidacy as a part of our larger political strategy of developing those spoilers, those credible threats to the left of the Democratic Party. So just appreciate you coming on and laying out both your strategy, thoughts, and want to just alert, again, our listeners that HB 101 is something that we're working on currently, to continue to try to support, and to, like Andy said, if folks are interested in watching the hearings in the Government, Labor, and Elections Committee tomorrow, to hear just more expansive conversation about some of those other initiatives to shift Maryland to a more multi-party system. So thanks for coming on, Andy. Appreciate you, man.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to come here and talk about this. It's weedsy and wonky stuff at times, but it's also really important because so many people want this and so many people understand that without this, they are powerless. And I think it's important for folks to know that there are steps that can be taken right here and right now in order to expand the possibility of this being a reality here in Maryland.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Andy, man. Good to see you as always, man.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So, hopefully you all, get a kind of greater sense of why for LBS it's important for us to talk about the importance of radical approaches to electoral politics. And to be clear, it would be in some ways easier and the political establishment would take it better if we didn't engage talking about electoral politics, right? There aren't things that LBS politically gains from even entertaining the conversation. But it's so important in terms of wanting to provide our people with mechanisms of electoral engagement that can actually get us to revolutionary policy. And so even though there are a lot of folks who we engage, who we are navigating the political landscape with, who would rather not address the conversation of electoral politics. And there's some conversations where people get really heated, like they're really heated conversations that are had, particularly in places where folks see themselves as pragmatists and see conversations about third-party campaigns as not being serious about concrete solutions. My hope is that what LBS models is what it looks like, highlighting the point Andy made about responsibly thinking about the use of third-party campaigns as leverage to have real material political results, and the work that the Green Party, Eugene the People's Progress Party, that we've engaged with over the years in Maryland. It is my belief that it has created leverage, that has created a more progressive city council, that has pushed the Democratic Party and the state legislature to the left. Those third-party campaigns, I think, contribute to helping LBS push policies that we've been able to be successful in moving over the years. But it's important that you only get that with a political perspective that's independent of the political status quo. So I want to, again, just encourage folks that if you're interested in continuing to hear this perspective, to be a sustainer. It helps provide the kind of independent political, our political independence. It allows us to be able to continue to bring these perspectives and to do them unapologetically, such that we're not threatened by the Democratic Party's establishment attempt to try to silence us. In my testimony on the bill that we mentioned, HB 101, I talk about my experience being on the Democratic Party State Central Committee, being elected to the State Central Committee, making many of the kinds of pronouncements and comments that I've made about the importance of credible threats to the left of the Democratic Party. I was elected and having those perspectives publicly, but was pushed out of the Democratic Party State Central Committee in large part because of my public engagement of these conversations. But it's important. It's important that we do so because our people deserve political options such that we can make these kind of public pronouncements about what is needed for the Democratic Party to ensure that it's responsive to our community. We need the space to be able to have those conversations without political consequences. I ain't tripping too hard about being put off of it. But it's important for people to know that that is the state, that is what it means to truly be a captured electorate, right? When it is seen as a threat to engage in independent politics outside of the two-party duopoly that has been imposed on our community that makes us a captured electorate of the Democratic Party. So I hope that you all, got a lot of information. Continue to look out for action alerts on all of our legislative items. If you can't be a sustainer, sign up so that you can send action alerts to help push our legislative items. It seems small, but it makes a big difference when people see their inboxes flooded with emails on our legislative items. Is a big part of how we've accomplished what we've accomplished. So if you can't be a sustainer, sign up to be on our email listserv to send out those action alerts. Once again, I'm Dayvon Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. Peace.